Hello and welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is automating PowerPoint content generation using Power Automate Desktop. So let's talk a little bit about why this episode is important. So I recently had a question from the YouTube channel just around whether or not it was possible to automate the generation of PowerPoint presentations. With the idea being that you have a template file and then a user could select one or more slides from that template file and create a new file as a result. And unfortunately, there is no PowerPoint connector to be used with inside of Cloudflows, so we need to be able to leverage Power Automate Desktop. This is kind of a great example of when you don't have APIs, when you don't have connectors, that you can go ahead and mimic the actions that an end user would typically go ahead and provide, and as a result, be able to accomplish something. And so this is kind of a great use case for that, because we're doing a lot of like copying, pasting, and trying to figure out where we are. And those are the same steps that a user would typically go ahead and perform. And so as a piece of advice, whenever you build these types of solutions, is just think through how you would do this manually, using keyboard and mouse, and then you can start to get into recording and then add actions on top of it as well. Now, in order to go ahead and choose which slides a person wants to include in the new template, you could go ahead and build a Power App. I'm a fan of Power Apps. I don't do a lot of Power App development, so that wasn't sort of a good fit for me. But what I decided to go ahead and use was a Microsoft form, and that worked out just fine for me in this case. What we'll do is from that form be able to pass a list of essentially slide numbers or page numbers to Power Automate Desktop, where we'll then go through the main template, select each of those, those slides, and then copy and paste them into a new template file and save it. So kind of an interesting problem to solve. Go ahead and check this out. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks. All right, so I'm going to do things a little bit differently than I normally do. We're going to start with the demo. Once you see it working end to end, then I think going into more details will make more sense. But I will revisit each of the major components, and we'll go through that in more detail. So let's jump into a demo. Okay, so we're going to start with the form here, and what you're going to notice, and I'll go through this in more detail once we get into the form design, but I've got pictures of each slide that I want to include in my template file. So I went ahead and manually did that, and then I've got a question whether or not I want to include it or not. And there's a reason why I have this convention, which I'll hold off for now. So I'm not going to include the first one. Let's include the second one. The third one, we'll skip a couple. We'll say no, and then we'll say 6 yes, 7 no, 8 yes, 9 no, and 10 yes. So we basically go ahead and select which of the slides that we do want to include in our presentation, and then we'll go ahead and click this submit button. Now, while that's running, we can flip over to Power Automate, and we will then check out the run history. We should see that it's running. Now, as normal, it does take a little bit of time for Power Automate Desktop to kick off, but we should see that happening here shortly. I might pause the recording here while that gets kicked off. Let's see. Okay, so here what's happening is we've got our PowerPoint templates opening. I do need to enable this copy button here. So what's going on right now is I'm waiting for an image to be detected. Once it detects that image, we'll then see that the copy menu in the upper left-hand corner has been enabled, which then will allow me to easily use Control-C on subsequent slides. So we'll just give that a few seconds, and there it's detected. Now, I've got those message box that disappear. That's just really just to show me and show you folks like what slide we're going to. So here we navigated to slide 2. Then what we've done is we issued a copy. Then we're going to flip over to our new presentation and we're going to paste it. Then next up, we'll go to slide 3, do the same thing. We're going to end the slideshow, copy, essentially Alt-Tab, but basically go into our other template, hit Control-V. Now we're skipping ahead to slide 6. So we'll go ahead and go to slide 6 and then get to the end the show, copy, flip over, paste, and then move on to our next slide. And if you're wondering why we go into presentation mode and then we end the show, there is a shortcut key which we'll talk more about, where if you enter the number of the slide, so say slide 9, you type 9 and then enter, it'll navigate to that slide. And then when you end the show, on the left hand side, that slide will be in context. So that allows me to just Control C on that slide in the left pane there that's in context, and then I can go ahead and paste it. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and we will save that the new file that we just created, and essentially our process is now done. And so yeah, we can see that it successfully ran. Now, I haven't implemented it, but we could easily go ahead and send an email from Power Automate Desktop, attach that file as an attachment, and then send it off to the person that submitted the form. Okay, so that was the demo end to end. Now let's talk more about the specifics of each of the components. So let's start with step number 1, our Microsoft form. So just go to forms.microsoft.com, create a new form, and then go ahead and create multiple choice questions. And here, as I mentioned before, I took screenshots and then uploaded them as images. Now, the naming convention is pretty important here, because I want to make this dynamic. I want to be able to loop through all of the questions and detect whether or not it's a yes or no. The problem with that is that inside of Power Automate, it uses this like GUID or this unique value, so I don't actually know what question is which. And so that's why it's important to have as your answers the question number and then yes or no. And so let me just flip to Power Automate Cloudflow. And if we go ahead and take a look at our form response, here it's slide 1, slide 3, and this is because I've labeled them correctly. But at runtime, we don't actually know what those values are. We have these values here. And so as a result, that's why that naming convention is pretty important, so that I can loop through all of these, and we'll talk more about that in the Cloudflow, and then look for the question number, and then whether or not it was a yes or a no. If it's a no, I ignore it. If it's a yes, I want to add it to my list. So that's why I've done it that way. I know it might look a little odd, but there's a reason for that. So if we head back over to our form, all I did was I went in and said add new. I did choice, that gave, say, the slide number, and then you can give it a more valid description. So for example, maybe slide 10 contains, information about a specific business process, then you can go ahead and highlight it there. Then what you can go ahead and do is click and insert an image. So then it was just a matter of like browsing my computer and then selecting the corresponding image and then having it uploaded here so that you can present that to your users. And then as I mentioned before, when I have my two options, so for this one, I would say this is 11, and this could be yes, and then this one would be 11, and it would be -no. So consistency is the name of the game. You need to make sure that you have everything consistent so that you can easily go ahead and parse it. So that's the form. Nothing too difficult in doing this, but actually worked pretty well. I thought, you might need to do this in a Power App, but this was certainly an easier solution there. All right, next up is going to create our Cloudflow. And so obviously the purpose of this is that we want to collect our form responses. As I kind of alluded to in the previous section, we do need to parse the question responses to figure out which question someone has answered yes to versus no to. And then what we want to do is form a list of page numbers separated by commas and pass that down to Power Automate Desktop. So for example, like 2, 3, 4, 7, 9 as an example. And that's kind of the contract between our Cloudflow and our desktop flow. Okay, so let's walk through this. First off, we've got Microsoft Form trigger when a new response is submitted. Select basically our form that we previously created. Then we want to go ahead and get the details by passing in the response ID. So that's going to be from the trigger. We get that value. Now there's a few different variables that I want to go ahead and collect here. So number one is a form response. This is going to be an array. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and split out the body of our response and split it by comma. Now you might be wondering, why do we want to do this? So it really comes down to our responses here. What I want to do is, here is our body. Technically, this is not an array of questions and answers. It would be cool if it was, because then I could go ahead and easily iterate through them. That's not the case. What we have is essentially this flat list, and I don't know which one is which. And like I said before, I want this to be dynamic. You know, Power Automate has figured this out when you do dynamic content, but like I said, I want it to be dynamic. So I could easily add another slide and not have to change my code. So what I'm going to do is going to create an array of all of these values by splitting on the comma. So each of these rows essentially is going to be put into my array, and then I'll be able to loop through it because I essentially have a collection. So that's what's going on here. I'm going to split the body based upon a comma, and we're going to store that in an array. And we'll see that array being used here shortly. Next up, we've got a variable, which is also going to be an array, and I'm just calling this form question. Now, the reason for this is we're going to essentially have, after we're in an array, we're going to have a row that looks like this, where we have this field, kind of like key value pair, which means nothing to me at this point, right? Like, it means something to Power Automate, but I don't know what this is. This could be question 1, this could be question 8, I don't know. So what we're going to do is we're going, for each of the rows that are in that array, we're going to split on it again. And we're going to split, this is going to be part 1, this is going to be part 2. Now, it is 0 based, so technically it's part 0 and part 1. So these are all of the values that I'm interested in, because now I know that for question 1, the answer was no. For question 2, the answer was yes. For question 3, the answer is yes, and so on and so forth. So that's what's going to happen here. We're going to have an array. It's going to be initialized to nothing at this point. We're just going to call it form question. Next up, another variable called slides. This is just going to be a string. This is going to be used to store that list of slides. So 3, 4, 5, 8, etc. And then we're also going to have an integer. I need to be able to do some trimming at the end because I'm going to be left with a comma at the very end of my string, and I need to remove that comma after the fact. This is going to help us in that regard. So now what we're going to do is we have that form response array, right, that we created here. We're going to loop through it, and then what we're going to do is, for the current item, we're going to split. So we can understand what is the current item by using this expression, item, and then open close parentheses, and then we're going to split on the colon. And so that's that step here that I was referring to. We're going to go through each one of these and then split based upon the colon here. So that's great. That'll give us that 0 and 1 based array. Then what I want to do is, for the 0 part, the first part of that form question that I've just assembled, I want to check to see if the length is greater than 15. Now, a few different ways to solve this. But I just went and looked at this and said, okay, this makes sense. So I'm not interested in the responder, and I'm not interested in the submit date when I'm talking about parsing these questions. Here we can see that these are like properly named attributes versus these are some sort of random, what looks kind of like a GUID. And so all I'm going to say is, like, is the first part of this array greater than 15 characters? And so in these two cases, responder and submit date, the answer is going to be no. And when we do split it, we're also going to get these quotations, so we have to account for that as well. So in that case, it's not going to be greater than 15, which is perfect because these other ones all are. And so that allows us just to process these question parts here. So that's what's going to happen here. If it's greater than 15, then what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and detect if the second part of that form question contains the value of yes. And so really what we're talking about now is looping through all of these rows, and then we're going to check to see if this column, this attribute, contains the word yes. If so, great, we're going to then want to add it to our list. If not, we're going to skip it. And so that's what's happening here. I am going to use a temp string, and what I'm doing within here is I want to, number one, replace all of my quotations and backslashes, because those get introduced automatically for us, and I'm going to replace them with nothing essentially. And so that's really important from that perspective. And then lastly, what I do want to do is I want to split based upon this dash. And so what that means is, if we look at this, because these, when we put this into an array, as I mentioned before, we're going to have these quotations that are included. So I want to get rid of those. And then what I want to be able to do is I just want to be able to split again on this delimiter and then grab the value of 2. So we'll go ahead and see what question we're referring to. And so that's what's happening in this particular expression. Then what we're going to go ahead and do is take the outputs from that previous step, and we're going to, because there was a split, so remember it'll create like another array, we're going to want to go and get the first part, because the first part is going to be our question number. And when we have that, we're going to also append a comma to it, and that will help us build our list. So we're going to loop through all of these records, and we're going to check to see if it's greater than 15. Okay, it is. Then we're going to check to see, does it contain yes? In this case, it doesn't. So we'll skip to the next record. Greater than 15? Yes. Contain yes? Yes. Then what we'll do is we'll split this value, we'll retrieve the first part of it, and then we'll append it to a string, and then add a comma to it. Now, as you can imagine, on our last step, our last iteration of that loop, we're going to add the comma to it, and that's not going to be good because that's going to leave us with a comma at the end that we don't want. So that's where I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get the length of this slides variable, and we're going to do that so that we can then basically do a substring on it. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to subtract 1 from that value, so that what we can do is perform that substring on it. So if we go ahead and look at the run history, we should be able to illustrate this. Sorry, I had to pause the recording there because I was in an old run history record. So here what's happening is we're basically on the 12th iteration, so the last iteration in my loop. We go ahead and we add 10 to that string called slides. And then what we have is this comma, which is not what we want, right? And so that's what we're going to want to do, is get the total length for our slides variable, and then we're going to subtract 1 to it. And when we do so, we basically remove that last string so that we have we can cleanly pass this value over to our Power Automate desktop flow. And then the Power Automate desktop flow can receive this list of pages and then loop through them accordingly. So I know this is a little bit sort of, there's a lot of parsing that's going on in here, but partly just based upon the constraints inside of the Microsoft's form connector and how it surfaces up data. Okay, so the next step is really around PowerPoint templates. And so what you see here is I've got kind of the main template, which you include all of your slides. Now you might be wondering, why do I have this like orange colored slide here? And we're going to see that when we get into the Power Automate desktop flow side of things. What we need to do is we need to get this copy button enabled so that we can hit Control-C whenever the slides are in context. Now, in order to do that, though, I need to be able to click on this slide. So what I've decided to do is use a wait for image action that will detect this slide here, like this image or this text, and then basically click the button, which makes this copy button enabled. So what I've done is, just change the color so I think that it's easier to detect it on the screen, as opposed to like everything else being the same color. So if you're doing this, what I would suggest is have like slide 1 is kind of like a template slide, have it look different than your other slides so that the Power Automate desktop component can go ahead and easily identify it. Then the other presentation we need is basically going to be blank. So what I've even done is, whenever you create a new PowerPoint presentation, there is a blank slide. I even got rid of that so that we just have, basically this shell of a template. And so what we're essentially going to do is we're going to, as you saw in the video, get into presentation mode, navigate to the slide that we need by entering the slide number plus enter. Then we're going to end the slideshow, hit Control-C with the slide in context that we were just on, basically flip to our other presentation, Control-V to paste it, and then sort of go back to the original PowerPoint template. So that's how we're essentially structuring this. So let's go through the Power Automate desktop side of things here, and what we're going to do is receive that list of page numbers from our Cloudflow. We'll then navigate through our template, copy slides based upon page number. We'll open up the second template, paste those slides into. And now you might be wondering as we go through this, like, wow, there's a lot of kind of weird things going on here. And I would agree, there's some suboptimal things that you have to do, like introduce wait statements and things like that. But it's partly due to like PowerPoint and just there be some nuances being included within that tool itself. Like, so for example, some actions or commands will have shortcut keys, some don't. So you end up doing this weird thing of like kind of a hybrid approach. The other thing I ran into was that I was having trouble with my escape key. So as you know, when you are in the main presentation view and you hit escape, that is supposed to end your slideshow. That stopped working for me on a couple machines that I tried it on. So I did have to revert to another approach of using right mouse click and then sending the letter E, which will end the slideshow. So lots of little things like that, which is kind of normal in the context of RPA. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our page list. Now, this is an input that's defined over here. So when you're doing local debug, you can have a default value, and this represents our page list. Now, when I call this from a Cloudflow, naturally the values coming from the Cloudflow are going to take precedent, but we do have this default value here. So what we're going to do is we're going to split the text and once again, essentially get an array so that we can loop over this list and then go and find slides 3, 4, 6, 8, and 9. But in the case of when we got called from Cloudflow, naturally that came from our form. Next up, what we want to do is open up a command session. And so what this is going to do is it's going to open up a command session and open to this working folder. Inside of this folder, that is where I have my templates. So my new presentation template, my Power Platform template that includes all of my slides. And then these are all of the new templates that I've created as a result. You do notice I've got a unique number here. I'll talk about that here shortly. So we're just going to open a command line. Then what we're going to do is generate a random number. This is just so I've got some uniqueness with the file names. And so we'll generate this number. It'll get stored in this random number variable. And then what we can go ahead and do is assign it to a new presentation name. Now, I did include this essentially as an input, predominantly so I have a default value, but you could go ahead and tweak that if you wanted. Then what we'll go ahead and do is we'll add that random number to the end of it, and we'll then go ahead and perform a copy function from our command line. So we're going to take a copy of the original blank template, and we're then going to name it with this new presentation name, which includes our random number here. Then what we're going to do is we're going to execute this command, which is basically typing in the name of our file. And what that does in a command line is that it'll actually go ahead and open it. So that'll open up PowerPoint and it will open up the blank template essentially. Now, as you can imagine, like when you go ahead and type that in and hit enter in a command line session, that happens instantaneously, but opening PowerPoint takes some time. And so that's why I've got a wait of 3 seconds here. Depending upon the speed of your machine, this value might need to be greater, might need to be less, but something you'll have to play with. Then what we're going to do is something similar with our command session is we're going to open up our other template, and we continue to use the same command session. So that's, nothing's changed from a folder perspective. We'll go ahead and open that. Now, because I'm copying and pasting here, I did this just to, just as a kind of like nice to have, just to make sure that I don't copy some old content. So for example, maybe my copy goes wrong and I don't actually cleanly get a copy. I could paste some older content. So I just clear my clipboard. And then what I'm going to do is wait for my PowerPoint template file to open. So this is the template that has all of my slides. We're just going to wait for that window to open. And so this is actually a pretty handy action where I'm using Find Window. There's a few different options. It's typically by window UI element. I found some good success here by just using the title. And so when this PowerPoint opens, it's going to have this title and it's easily able to find it. And then once it's opened, I want to make sure that we have focus on it as well. The focus window, this is probably gets a little redundant, but I just want to make sure I'm in that window before I start executing commands. Now what I'm doing here is I'm going to send keys to the foreground and I'm going to hit Alt-H. Now what Alt-H is going to do is it's going to get me into the home screen, which is where I am right here. And as I mentioned before, I want to get this copy icon to show up. Now the way you do that is I can click on it, and if I click on this slide, I can see that this is now in context. And so what this allows me to do is whenever I'm on a slide, just hit Control-C because this is enabled. If I don't have this enabled, what ends up happening, I can hit Control-C all I want, but it's not actually going to work unless that's in focus. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm going to this menu, and I want to be able to visually see this copy button appear. Now, when I'm doing this manually, can click on this and it'll basically become active. But if a bot's doing it, we need to do something a little bit different. And so that's what I'm doing here is I'm going to wait for image. And what I do is I go in and I can select an image. And basically what it'll allow me to do is capture that image inside of my PowerPoint. So if I go ahead and do this and head over to PowerPoint, I would be able to then select this area. Now, the problem with wait for image is that screen resolution size will have an issue here. You want to make sure that whatever screen you're using for recording is the same screen and resolution that you're going to be using when you execute this. And this is why I'm not a huge fan of wait for image, because it's rather sensitive. And as a result, this is why I have enabled this fail with timeout error, to make sure that if it can't find it, the whole process, we get a failure from that perspective. We stop the process. But the idea is that I can go ahead, when that image is detected, I'll then be able to go ahead and send a left mouse click, because we have two variables that are being produced, X and Y. Now you might wonder, why do I have like a few of these showing up here? This is just some trial and error. Like I was running into some interesting situations when I was using my work machine versus my personal machine versus plugged into a screen at work, at our office. And so that's why you see a few different variations. I've got the slide image v4, which is set up for my current configuration, so that's good. So once we find that specific image, or I know I'm in this right place, I'll go ahead and issue a click. And when I issue a click, now I know I have context from that perspective. This is another action which I thought it's new. I haven't sort of seen this before, but this was just to block user and mouse keyboard input, probably an optional thing, but just to ensure that if you're messing around with your keyboard and mouse when this is running, that those things get ignored. So once again, gonna make sure, because I'm in a loop here, so I'm gonna once again make sure my PowerPoint template is in focus. I do have a display message. This is more for debugging purposes. This could be removed, but I just want to make sure I'm on the right page so that when I see this running, I can see that, okay, I'm on page 3 and I'm on slide 3. So it just allows me to do that. I will close this box automatically, so I don't have to touch the mouse to do it. That'll take place after 1 second. So this could technically be removed. Then what I'm going to go ahead and do here is I'm going to hit Alt-S. Now what does Alt-S do? So when I'm in this mode, if I hit Alt-S, I'm going to head over to the slideshow tab, and then what we're going to do next is we're going to click this button from current slide, and that's going to get us into presentation mode. And so that's That's what's the next step. And so by getting into presentation mode, and then we're going to wait a couple seconds, we can now go ahead and issue a send keys command. So the current page, and then hit return. So if I'm over in this slide and I'm in that mode, and I want to go to say slide 3, I can enter 3 and then the enter key, and then I head over to slide 3. Now this is where I was having some issues with the escape button. Like I'm hitting the escape button, but it's doing nothing right now. So that's why I changed things up to right mouse click and then send the E key, and that will end the show. Put slide 3 in context, and now I can go ahead and issue a Control C command. So that's what's happening here, is we send keys. Basically it's our current page with a return key. We're going to wait 1 second. We'll then right mouse click. We'll wait 1 second. We'll send the E key, which is going to end the show. We'll wait 2 seconds. We'll then go ahead and send a Control C combination, which will then allow us to copy that slide. We'll wait 2 seconds. We're going to change the focus to our other presentation, that's blank one. We're going to wait 3 seconds because sometimes that can take a few seconds to Alt-Tab essentially. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and issue Control V, which will paste that slide into the new presentation. And then what I'm doing here is I am issuing a Control S. And what that is going to do in this case is save. So every time we add a slide, I essentially go ahead and save the presentation. Now, if the slide is in a folder that's part of your OneDrive, you can enable that automatic save feature. In this case, it's not there, so I'm basically issuing Control S. When I'm done the loop, I've looped through every page that I need to go do this for. I can go ahead and close those windows. Now, at this point, if I wanted to go ahead and send an email, we do have the exchange action over here, and I could go ahead and send an email through Exchange. And so that is essentially the walkthrough of the PowerPoint side of the functionality using Power Automate Desktop. All right, so that concludes another video on the channel. Thanks for checking it out. I know it was a little bit lengthy, but it's a pretty cool use case, so hopefully you enjoyed that. If you're not following me on Twitter, go ahead and follow me at Weirzy, and you're obviously on YouTube, so go ahead, like, subscribe, and comments are always welcome. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.